Ellice and Bo. Ellice looked up at Bo and smiled tentatively. He was only a year or two older than her at 14 summers, but stood a head taller. His smile was friendly, but there was a look in his eyes that said otherwise. "You know why it has to be us." He looked a bit startled, dropped his gaze to her. He wore a plain shift, bandy knees muddy and bruised, but otherwise hale and hearty. The split oak was in front of them, and from it wafted a smell of ancient darkness, death, and stale air. "We're the youngest," he trailed off. "Not just that." She looked up at him. "Our families have an understanding. You and I." Bo nodded and closed the distance between them. The day was overcast, the oak standing bleak and tall and alone, the villagers surrounding them from a distance. If they didn't do it voluntarily, Ellice knew, it would be done to them, and it would be so much worse for them, their families, and the village. "You and I," he repeated, his hand on her arm. She took his hand and put it on her chest. "Young love, young lust, enough to give the tree life, enough to give the village life." Bo snorted, but didn't remove his hand. Her courses had started last year. Her mother had said she was almost past marrying age, that if it wasn't Bo, and then the storm which had cracked the oak and damaged the village accordingly. He had seemed interested enough, and she had wanted children. And that was denied them. There was no running. To run would be to deny the village, to let it flounder and die without the protection of the oak. To run would be to deny her heritage, and they would be caught regardless. "The tree is large enough," she spoke softly. "It will recognise us, will enfold us. We will have time. We will be together." Bo snorted again. "I wanted to be a wheelwright," he muttered. "I wanted children," she answered softly. "But we, you and I, Bo, will shelter and protect the village. We will keep them safe. We have no option." Bo shook his head, removing his hand. "I'm fast. I reckon I can get past them. The villagers, I mean." "Your folks, mine, neighbours. And when you're gone, when the crops fail, when the storms come, when there's nothing to eat, will you come back then and provide for the village?" He scowled, itching to run, and yet again the look in his eyes said something different. "It won't hurt," Ellice said, casting off her shift. She was thin, always hungry, her ribs visible. The hair on her head, under her arms and at her hips, always itched. A breeze wafted in and she smelled them, her and Bo, and possibly the scent of the villagers carried in. The scent of unwashed bodies, of filth and life balanced close to death. "I will go to the oak. Will you join me?" Ellice turned and walked towards it slowly. She was aware the villagers had moved in closer, her family, her neighbours, the elders amongst them. She stopped by the oak, running her hand over the hole torn in its trunk, the hole which gave them admittance. "Ellice," Bo spoke softly, close by her shoulder. She turned. He had stripped, was equally gaunt, hairy, mud-streaked and mud-ingrained, but where her body disappeared between her legs, his protruded. She had seen her father ploughing her mother often enough to know what they had to do once inside the tree, but seeing the seed giver up close. His hand was on her back, She ducked down and stepped inside the oak. It smelled of mushrooms and something dank, fetid, something rotten. The ground beneath her feet was rotten. Something brittle snapped, a hard, sharp, cracking sound. She didn't look down. The oak twisted and turned, and she had to twist to stand up. The knotted insides of the tree close around her, hard protrusions against her back and thighs. Bo followed her in. For a moment his body still carried reflected light and he glowed, and then it faded, and she could smell him, could hear his breathing close by. His hands, surprisingly cold, explored her lower body, and then she felt something prodding against her, something demanding admittance. She steadied herself against the tree, marvelling at how there was almost no light, and yet she could almost see the veins within its body. And then his seed-giver was pushing into her, and she was forced back against the unyielding tree. He pushed and thrust, and she put her arms up to touch the tree but could not reach. It had seemed to grow and stretch around them. She drew her arms around his back as best she could and clung to him as he battered against her, and she blinked and could then see. The tree moved around them. It was massive, far larger than the grain store, far larger than what she had led the way into. The earth was no bar to it. The tree roots extended far down below, and it was like the faintest of knife-point sensations, touching her fingers, each sensation being a creature of the forest deep underground, or the sensation of the tree roots themselves growing and thrusting deeper into the soil. Above her was no sky, no heavens as promised, no openness, but it was not dark either. She could see the pale veins of green, shrouded in browns and blacks, running all the way upwards, far beyond what her eyes could see. Bo slammed into her, gasping, and Ellice became aware of herself again, aware that she couldn't move, that the tree had closed around her. There were brittle bones beneath her feet, her lover inside her, and the tree encompassing them, wrapping itself tighter and tighter around her, drawing and draining her strength, his strength, leaching it out, feeding it to the tree branches, to the roots, casting it out further than that. She was aware of the villagers, of the village. The oak protected and sheltered them. Their crops would be abundant. No storms would trouble them. The tree would draw from them, would drain them until they were husks, and then draw even more from them, until their bodies gave out, until their bones were all that remained. Inside of her, Bo stirred. The oak fed back into him. It wanted his seed in her to draw it out, her fruitfulness to protect and nurture the tree itself and the village. He thrust, and it was almost enjoyable. The feel of the tree moving through him, feeding into her, feeding her, drawing from her. Their hips were locked together. Cheek to cheek, part of the tree, her tongue forgotten, spoken language gone from her as the sap flowed inside. She held Bo tight, wrapping her arms around the village to keep them from harm. The people of the so-called Dark Ages were far more in tune with not only the natural world, but also the potential of other worlds, other ways of being, a far more spiritually active people. I will not be exploring paganism, witchcraft or the like here, beyond noting that the world as is now was not the world that was, and maybe that's a shame, and maybe that's a blessing, but mostly I think it's both.